Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Erin Taylor, and I'm the Field and Campaigns Senior Vice President at the Climate Reality Project. It's really great to be here with so many climate reality leaders from around the world as we kick off our campaign education series. Before we get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. First, I want to make sure that everyone was available to access the captions in your own language. So to access them, please click on the Show Captions button at the bottom of your Zoom window and click the Translate to option. And then click More to see the full list of languages available. We'll be dropping links to resources in the chat, but if you have questions for the panelists during the webinar, please use the Q&A function found at the bottom of the Zoom window to share those questions. There will be time for audience Q&A, and we'll be pulling our questions from the Q&A box, as well as using those that were shared during registration. Lastly, on this call is being recorded now, and the recording and any accompanying resources will be sent out in a follow-up email early next week. Okay, so let's get started. Climate Reality Project recently shared a 2030 strategy, a new strategic vision that will guide our work until the end of the decade. And it focuses on 4 key areas: anti-greenwashing, reducing emissions, financing a just transition, and strengthening global cooperation. With this webinar, we're kicking off an educational series on each of these campaigns to make sure that the members of all of our global network have a robust foundational knowledge as we set course over the next few years. So today, as the World Bank and the IMF just wrapped their fall meeting, we're starting with financing a just transition and demystifying global climate finance, which can be dense and technical. So to set that foundation and get us started, we're excited to welcome representatives from 3 of our Climate Reality branch offices who are going to share their expertise and experiences with us. For our main panel, we'll be joined from Manila by Nazrin Castro, branch manager for the Climate Reality Project Philippines, and from Johannesburg by Courtney Morgan, campaigner with the African Climate Reality Project. Itzel Morales, community director for the Climate Reality Project Latin America, will be joining us from Mexico City towards the end of our time together to go over how you can take action and help make a difference. So with that, thank you very much, and I'm going to turn it over to Courtney. Take it away.
Hi, everybody. So as Erin mentioned, I'm Courtney from the Africa branch, and I'm based in Johannesburg. So I will be speaking from the African perspective, but much of what I'm saying will be able to be translated as well. So just to start, I'd like to talk about how we got here. So as we know, climate change is here. It is real. We are already seeing the effects of climate change all around the world, especially in Africa, in the forms of floods, droughts, and other extreme weather events. And really, as the climate movement, we have spent decades talking about the solutions for both mitigation and adaptation. We have progressed, and there are visions that exist for how we build a sustainable future where communities are able to safeguard their livelihoods and survive the climate crisis. But now, as climate groups, we are beginning to grapple with how to make these futures a reality. And we're really grappling with the fact that climate action needs financing. A just transition, building resilient communities, creating alternatives, all of these things cost money. So this is why we're having this webinar. So climate finance refers to the local, national, or transnational financing, which may be drawn from public, private, and alternative sources of financing to support action on climate change. So that's the broad definition that we can all kind of use going forward. And it's really important to know that definition, but also what it looks like practically. So I'm just going to explain a little bit about that as well. Climate finance can be used for various projects related to adaptation, to mitigation, ecosystem restoration, community development, as well as addressing loss and damage, etc. There are a couple of different things that it can be used for. And it can also come in a number of forms, such as grants, commercial loans, concessional loans, or guarantees. It's also important to understand how does climate finance work and how does it flow. And it can be mobilized through various financial mechanisms, which we'll explain a bit more as we get into the webinar. So these mechanisms or funds created for this specific purpose. Usually, developed countries allocate finances to these mechanisms with the intention of that finance flowing to the global south. With regard to accessing those funds and those financial mechanisms and climate finance ultimately, there's usually some kind of application process for national or international agencies, private sector entities, or large organizations to be able to be accredited with these institutions that hold the funds and then enter into some kind of agreement. And these are usually quite long and complicated processes that often require resources, which makes it quite difficult to navigate for smaller groups and under-resourced agencies in the event of a climate emergency. So that's kind of, what climate finance is, where it comes from, what it looks like. But we know that that's not the whole story. While as the climate movement, we recognize the need for financing solutions, we're also recognizing that financing, even climate finance, if not directed to those who need it most and to projects that truly benefit the community and those most affected, it has the potential to worsen inequality in our current system. And this is why we look at climate finance as not just a question of simply setting up a fund or distributing funds, but at its core as a climate justice issue. Next. So I think it's also important to know, to be able to quantify this, right? We look at climate finance, but quantify it. How much is already being committed and how much do we need? Historically, we know that there has been a disproportionate contribution to the climate crisis, meaning that certain regions, namely the global south, have not really contributed to emissions as much as the global north. And so when it comes to financing, many believe that the majority of climate finance should come from historical polluters under the polluter pays understanding and those with the capability to contribute. The need for financing is not a new thing. It is reflected in quite a number of global climate agreements, including the Paris Agreement. But really, we go back to 2009 at COP15 in Copenhagen. A commitment was made to mobilize $100 billion US dollars per year by the end of 2020 for climate action in the global south. That agreement was then formalized in the following year. And in Paris, the goal was then extended to 2025 because, as we know, in 2020, it was not achieved. As we looked at this year, 2023, that goal has still not been realized. So we know that there's that kind of disparity. Developing countries, including the most vulnerable and most affected, were at a climate deficit of 381.6 billion USD from 2013 to 2020. So I think the question is really, it's obviously very clear that we need this financing and that there's a deficit of financing, but it's also important to look forward and understand how much do we really need. So for adaptation, developing countries are estimated to require up to $300 billion a year by 2030 in climate finance to adapt agriculture, infrastructure, water supplies, and other aspects of economies to neutralize the impacts of climate change. For mitigation, clean energy investment needed for developing countries is estimated to be around 2 trillion USD annually by 2030 to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. These numbers are credible estimates, but other credible sources vary on how much is really needed and how much will be needed as we go, because as we know, the crisis is unpredictable in many ways. Another difficult part of the climate crisis is that there is not an agreement on what constitutes a climate project. And this leads to a lot of challenges around where the money goes. Next. So this is what we say, that not all investment is equal. More than 80% of clean energy investment today is occurring in advanced economies and China, and the majority of climate finance, including clean energy investment that is provided to developing countries, has historically been in the form of debt-creating instruments such as loans, often with quite high interest rates. Developing countries, especially those in the global south, often borrow at a rate up to 8 times higher than developed and global north countries. We have to understand that the affordability of the clean energy transition will depend on reducing the cost and increasing the availability of capital or the availability of finance. The average cost of reducing emissions in developing economies is expected to be half the cost required for emissions reductions in advanced economies. Because of the high interest rates on loans, today we see that many countries are forced to service their debt rather than invest in sustainable development. This can lead to a feedback loop of exploiting natural resources, including fossil fuels, to generate income and profit for servicing debt, which of course then further contributes to climate change and keeps us in this cycle. What these high interest rates and these loans also do is that it delays progress, right? So countries that already have a lot of debt means that there's slower advancement of achieving development, but also slower advancement of achieving our overarching climate goals. Next. So I know that was a lot of information about finance and how it flows and who uses it and that kind of thing. So maybe it's important to also discuss what you can do and how do you actually stay aware and understand what's happening in the financial world. Firstly, we know that not everyone is an economist, and that's a good thing. So when we talk about climate finance and we encourage campaigning, for example, around these issues, we're not asking for everybody to all of a sudden understand a loan agreement or how loan agreements work or how interest rates work or how to access financing. But there are a couple of questions that all of us can ask about finance, specifically development finance and climate finance, that can really question these deals and help us understand how to actually interact with this financing. So the first question is, what are existing donor-recipient relationships? So if this is a bilateral agreement, so if this is from country to country, what are the existing relationships between these countries or between this bank and this region? The second question then is what the amount of funds or support are and the condition of these funds. So as I mentioned, loan agreements tend to have really high interest rates. And so we need to understand that before we sign these agreements and before we agree to these loans, we need to know how much money is being given to us and what are the conditions of this money. Sometimes it's policy change, sometimes it's an interest rate, and we really need to be aware of that before we just take money. We also need to question what are the sectors in which this is intended to be used. So is this money coming in just for agriculture? Is it coming in just for electricity distribution? We need to understand, is this a sector that really needs this financing in our countries? And it's different for all of our countries. The next question is, who are the recipients and what are the impacts of change, right? So who is receiving this money? Is it coming to a regional bank in the area to distribute the funds? Is it coming to a government? Is it coming to an entity within the country? We need to understand who is actually receiving the money, which feeds into the next question. Who will be tasked with allocating and dispersing the funds? Is it going to be national treasury? So is the government completely going to decide where this money goes? And is it their task to actually disperse these funds? Sometimes that is the case and sometimes that isn't the case. We also have different relationships with our national treasuries. So we need to understand, is that the best way that money should flow? The next question is, what are the monitoring mechanisms of this funding? And what that means is, how are we going to monitor and watch where the money goes? Are there already mechanisms or guidelines set up that us as the public can plug into and make sure that the government or the treasury said that 200 million was going to this specific project? What is the mechanism for us to hold that accountable and check? if that money is actually going where it's supposed to go. And then the last question, especially with loan agreements, is why can domestic, sorry about that, why can domestic funds not be used? Next. And these are all really questions that anybody can ask, right? And you don't have to have an economics degree to do that. So also I'm hoping that if you joined this webinar, it is because you do care and you are aware and you're hoping to get involved. But if you're not, it's also important to ask, to talk about why we should care as an everyday person, why we should care about climate finance, about money, about all of these systems. And really the answer is we should care because climate finance has the potential to scale up climate action in a way that delivers justice as well as development, but only if it takes a principled and a human rights approach. We should also care because we need to understand that the economy is not something that is happening to us. We are part of it. So we have to, as everyday people, we have to be able to take up space and make sure that we are holding institutions, many of which who are using public funds, to a standard that we want and to call for and demand things that we want. So essentially, we must ensure that climate finance deals center justice outcomes and center people instead of profit. In our work around the Just Energy Transition Partnership, or the JETP in South Africa, we, along with the Fair Finance Coalition of Southern Africa, have consistently called for a justice approach to JETPs, which are also spreading around the world now. So while, just to give you a bit of insight into some of the work that we've done, while the JETP investment plan was not made available to us until a day before it was negotiated at COP, the coalition worked with civil society groups, affected communities, and other climate justice and social justice groups to develop a set of guiding principles for climate finance. And essentially, this can be used as a set of guidelines to call for justice, to call for a number of things without even having to see the loan agreement or the investment plan of a deal. So there are 8 principles. I'm going to quickly go through them. The first one is that of equity. Funding should take into account historic inequalities and ensure redress and equity. Internationally, as those who became wealthy on the back of greenhouse gas emissions and colonial extraction, the global north has a responsibility to support global south nations and their plans for addressing the past and current impacts of climate change, and how these impacts affect their societies, as well as the efforts to develop and transition their economies. We believe that a human rights approach must also take into account equity, because climate finance must address these inequalities and create solidarity between North and South through the provision of unconditional financing to the global South and those regions with poor capacity to adapt to changing climate. We have to always keep in mind that finance is not neutral and can play a role in enabling new forms of support that can advance justice elements. The next principle is that of transparency. Public participation in climate finance processes needs free, prior, and public access to information. Transparency should be achieved prior to any consultation or decision-making and be coupled with measures to ensure wide-reaching public education on relevant topics. Climate finance must be transparent. Details about terms, conditions, types, impacts, and implementation must be openly accessible to the public throughout the process. The next principle is that of inclusion. Diverse stakeholders, especially those directly impacted by any proposed action, must give their free, prior, and informed consent. Those directly affected must be represented in decision-making meetings and meaningfully participate in decision-making, not just tokenism. After consent has been given, stakeholders must continue to be involved throughout the implementation processes. Stakeholder engagement must continue to ensure fair and participatory financing. Consistent engagement with diverse stakeholders allows for regular assessment of appropriateness of the financing. Is it actually working? Is it actually doing what it intended to do? The next principle is that of accountability and governance. We have to have channels, structures, roles, and mechanisms that are clear and accessible to the public. Decision makers and decision-making processes should be developed and understood by all stakeholders. Grievances with the financing process, implementation, and distribution should be able to be raised directly with the responsible entity and not through convoluted channels where we don't actually reach the people who are distributing the funds. We believe that all financing should include stringent anti-corruption measures. The next one is human rights centered. A human rights-based approach to climate finance is important in affirming and advancing universal, inalienable, and accessible rights. Finance processes and projects finance must not compromise human rights or environmental and social well-being. So this is where we talk about human rights being important, justice being important. Social justice is climate justice. The next principle is that of gender responsiveness. Financing processes must be acutely aware of and aim to prevent practices that exclude women and adopt practices that place women in leadership positions, particularly in land ownership, economic participation, decision-making, and employment. Financing must not perpetuate existing inequalities and must empower communities through the empowerment of women. The second last principle is then of holistic climate justice. Climate finance must meet the needs of climate crisis-related mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. Climate finance must ensure social protection and justice as well, such as housing, security, water, food, and dignified employment for all. Again, climate justice is social justice. The last principle that we speak about in our African context, but this can be translated to any of your local contexts. We believe that we have to have African-led local solutions in a post-colonial, extractive, and exploitative global financial system. Building and strengthening locally centered solutions to the climate crisis must be prioritized for climate finance targets. Understanding that the impact of development aid and multilateral loans across the continent and really across the global south have undermined local and grassroots solutions and human rights. Climate finance must be an opportunity. We must take this opportunity to empower local solutions by local actors. So these are really things that we can all call for and that we can add to and translate into your own local contexts. And you don't need to be able to read a policy document or a loan agreement to be able to do this. This is how you take a principled approach to climate finance, in addition to also knowing the general definitions of what climate finance is. I'm now going to hand over to Naz from the Philippines branch to talk us through some more details about MDBs or multilateral development banks, but she will explain what that is and how we can interact with them. Over to you, Naz.
Thanks, Barney. Thanks, Barney. Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm tasked to answer 3 questions. First is, what are multilateral development banks or MDBs? They are international financial institutions with a common task of fostering economic and social progress in countries by financing projects. Second, supporting investment. And third, generating capital for the benefit of all people. MDBs can fund and promote projects through infrastructure, education, energy, and even environmental sustainability projects. In simpler terms, think of your commercial banks. They provide financing services to you as an account owner with the objective of making a profit. MTBs, on the other hand, provide countries with lower cost financing with the goal of improving their economic conditions, primarily reducing poverty and inequality in the world. So there are different forms of MDBs, but I'll be discussing 2 main forms. First are those institutions established after World War II to facilitate international cooperation within the global financial system. So look at the three logos in the slide. First is World Bank. We also have International Development Association, which is very important in financing African countries with zero to low cost credits or even grants. We also have the International Monetary Fund. We have the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And the other form of MDBs are called regional MDBs, which are focused on the development of specific countries and low-income nations that can borrow collectively from the Multilateral Development Bank. So examples are European Investment Bank. We also have the Asian Development Bank, which is headquartered in Manila. We have the Islamic Development Bank. We have African Development Bank and Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank as some of the examples. So now the question is, what is the role of multilateral development banks on climate change? The answer is very big because MDBs provide relief to debt distressed countries and unlock investment for climate action. MDBs can help low and middle income countries achieve climate smart development. MDBs whose major shareholders are developed countries like the US, France, Germany, have been able to mobilize resources at scale because they can raise cheap finance on capital markets that can be channeled through low carbon development projects in developing countries like the Philippines. So second question is, there is a notion that funding climate projects is risky, but I would like to debunk that. While climate financing is deemed risky, the risks of not financing climate projects are even greater. If we fail to take action on climate change, the economic, social, and environmental costs will be greater and devastating. So I will be discussing 5 risks associated with climate finance. First is physical risks. Climate change is already leading to more extreme weather events such as hurricanes, floods, and droughts. These events can damage or destroy climate finance projects, such as renewable energy infrastructure or even agricultural adaptation measures. Second is transitional risks. The transition to low carbon economy, meaning from your brown industries to green industries, will require significant investments and changes to existing businesses and lifestyles. Third is policy risk. Climate change policies in different countries, especially in developing countries, are still evolving. And there is a risk that changes in policy could make climate finance projects less viable. Fourth is credit risks. Climate finance projects are often located in developing countries, the global south, which have higher credit risks than developed countries, which are countries in the global north. And lastly, technology risks. Climate finance projects often involve new and emerging technologies, which may not be fully proven or may be more expensive than expected. It is important to note that the risks of climate financing are not evenly distributed. Developing countries are generally more vulnerable to the risks of climate change compared to developed countries. Therefore, climate finance needs to be more accessible and affordable for developing countries, and that there needs to be a greater focus on de-risking climate finance or climate projects. One of the key ways to de-risk climate finance is to improve the quality of project design and implementation. This includes ensuring that projects are well aligned with national development priorities and that they have the capacity to withstand climate risks. There is no better way to design a project than to take the perspective of a country experiencing the impacts of climate change, meaning developed countries should be listening to developing countries in a way when we design projects and access climate finance. Another way to de-risk climate finance is to develop innovative financial instruments. For example, climate bonds can be used to spread the risk of climate finance projects over a large number of investors. There's also the green insurance products. Think of your life insurance or your laptop or your Mac insurance that can also be used to protect climate finance projects from extreme weather events and other risks. There is also need for greater collaboration between governments, donors, and private sector to de-risk climate finance. So earlier, Courtney explained that climate finance could be both public, private. So there are different multi-stakeholders in terms of pooling funds, climate financing. So every sector, every institution plays a major role in terms of de-risking climate finance. All stakeholders need to work together to develop innovative solutions and to create a more supportive environment for climate finance. So the Paris Agreement embeds the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. This principle recognizes that all countries have a responsibility to address climate change, but that developed countries have a greater responsibility due to their historical contribution to the problem and their greater capacity to respond. Again, there are two components. The developed countries' historical contribution to greenhouse gas emission, and your position, the position of developed countries in terms of having greater capacity to respond to the impacts of climate change. This principle is reflected in the Paris Agreement's goal of mobilizing 100 billion US dollars per year by 2020 from developed to developing countries to support climate mitigation and adaptation actions. Now, we're calling for multilateral development banks to set a goal for at least tripling 3 times of financing to 100 billion US dollars annually within 5 years. And the last of the 3 questions is, what is the role of fossil fuel subsidies? Basically, these are subsidies that government interventions that incentivize and artificially reduce the cost of fossil fuel production and consumption. Why artificially? Later on, I will discuss that. These may take the form of tax breaks, price controls, could be loan guarantees, funding for research and development, especially for exploration of large-scale fossil fuel projects and other incentives. These, however, result in inefficient government budget allocation, increased risk to public health and safety because it promotes more projects on fossil fuels, higher carbon emissions because there is support from government, and wider poverty gap. According to the International Monetary Fund, fossil fuel subsidies surged to a record of 7 trillion US dollars last year, rising by 2 trillion US dollars over the past 2 years due to the higher energy prices caused by Russia's invasion and, of course, because of the pandemic recovery. So removing fossil fuel subsidies would prevent 1.6 million premature deaths annually, which are related to air pollution, raise government revenues by 4.4 trillion US dollars because now subsidies could be reallocated to social programs of governments and put emissions on track towards reaching global warming targets, which is 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold determined in the Paris Agreement. So governments now need to look at the external costs of subsidizing fossil fuels in terms of damages to public health, environment, and climate, as well as sacrificing budget for other development programs. Rechanneling fossil fuels subsidies towards climate finance heeds to the call of implementing energy reforms through modernization of power grids and adopt distributed and renewable energy systems. And beyond having the political will, government must have the right and just enabling policies and measures to safeguard the welfare, especially of the poor and disenfranchised in this transition. And that ends my presentation.
Thank you so much, Courtney and Nazrin, for your comprehensive overview on climate finance. I learned so much from you. I'd like now for us to take a moment to dig a little deeper into some of what you talked about, and hopefully answer a few of our own questions and some from the audience. So a quick reminder to our audience that this is really your last chance to submit any questions for the Q&A. So please put those in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So let's just get started with a question, both of you, if you could kind of just talk about it and share your views on why loss and damage funding is so important. So why don't, Courtney, I'll start with you since Naz was just speaking, give her a break, and you start and then you can pass it over to Naz.
Sure. Thanks, Erin. I think loss and damage is actually a very important question, and maybe even for us to define what it is before we get into why it's important. So as we know, adaptation is about the impacts of climate change and dealing with those impacts. Mitigation is about dealing with the cause of climate change, so really reducing emissions. But loss and damage is the financing we need for events where adaptation and mitigation have not reduced vulnerability. So these are really impacts, especially, in South Africa, we've had a recent flood that killed 400 people in KwaZulu-Natal. And that really is what we're looking at as a loss and damage event, where any kind of adaptation and mitigation did not reduce the vulnerability of those 400 people who lost their lives. So really with loss and damage, we're talking about the loss of life and the damage to infrastructure. And it's important because, as we know, the most vulnerable are the most exposed to climate change. And because those communities are the most exposed, we need to have emergency funds and loss and damage funds separate from adaptation and mitigation. I think that's the biggest thing about loss and damage, making sure that when we talk about financing for loss and damage, this does not fall under adaptation. This is a separate need for financing. So I think that's really why it's so important, because those who are already vulnerable are just the inequalities are already exacerbated by climate change, and so we need that financing. Naz?
Yeah, to add to what Courtney said, I would just like to answer in the using the lens of debt. Funding loss and damage is clearly very important right now, because if not for the impacts of climate change to vulnerable countries, these countries would be twice as wealthy today were it not for climate change. In countries like the Philippines, the climate translates to a debt crisis as loss and damage continue to drive up the cost of capital and debt to unsustainable levels. Just to give in terms of economic numbers, in the past decades, a report commissioned by the V20 finance ministers representing 68 vulnerable countries estimated that 54 of the world's climate vulnerable developing and least developed countries, which are emitting only 5% of the global greenhouse gas emissions, have lost approximately 525 billion US dollars, which accounts to 20% of their collective GDP. Just imagine if that could be channeled to social programs of those countries. For some, these are merely economic numbers, but for us in the global south, Philippines, Africa, this means catalogs of more casualties and deaths, more homeless and jobless people, and more families going back to poverty or falling down below poverty line.
Thank you. Yeah, great input there on all of that. And Naz, I just want to ask you one more thing. We just had a meeting a few weeks ago of the Green Climate Fund. It was a pledge meeting. And can you just explain maybe what the Green Climate Fund is and why it is so important to global finance? Like, what is its role there?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the Green Climate Fund is also an international fund created within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to support low emission, meaning mitigation projects, and climate resilience, meaning adaptation projects and programs in developing countries, meaning you've said pledging, replenishment. We are asking pledges, commitments from developed countries to put into the fund, to the Green Climate Fund, to fund projects of developing countries. So basically, it is the only standalone multilateral financing entity whose sole mandate is to serve the UNFCCC and aiming to deliver equal amounts to mitigation projects and to adaptation projects. Why is it important to put funding into GCF? First, because it has a unique feature, which is enhancing country ownership, meaning projects should be aligned with national development plans. Second is that it has direct access feature, meaning the Green Climate Fund could channel the funding directly to countries through their national accredited entities. So to date, just to give you an overview, GCF has committed nearly 13 billion US dollars to support almost 130 developing countries. And half of that financing supports adaptation. And at least half of that adaptation resources supports least developed countries in African countries. But again, that is not enough.
Thank you so much. Yes, that is not enough. And we know, as I understand it, countries can make pledges at any time. They do not have to wait for the meeting. So we're hoping more and more Western countries will step up and commit more dollars to that fund. Okay, I am going to ask a question from the audience, which is, how do we increase finance for clean energy specifically? Courtney, do you want to start with that, and then Naz can respond also?
Sure. I think this is the age-old question of mitigation, is how do we get financing for the kind of energy that we want? And I think for us, we've really been campaigning for MDBs to implement a fossil fuel exclusion plan, because I think it's important to note that as we increase funding for renewables, we must also see a decrease in funding for fossil fuels, right? So we have a bank here in South Africa who are one of the biggest funders of clean energy, but are also still carrying out a lot of fossil fuel projects on the continent. So it's also about finding that balance, and how we increase that is really through engaging with banks, engaging on strategies, but also if it is, and really being able to, be supported by economic justice organizations who are able to assist us with the campaigning around that. That's what we've been doing in the African context. But really also it's about making sure that these banks, and if it is a MDB, for example, or a regional development bank, who are the shareholders? Who are the country shareholders that we can go to really try and implement fossil fuel exclusion policies, and to really stop. We have to divert that financing to renewable energy through campaigns and through policy discussions and policy reform.
I know we all represent diverse entity institutions in this webinar now. So I'll be sharing ways on how to increase financing for renewable energy. First is government support. It can play a role in increasing finance for renewable energy by, again, removing subsidies and moving that towards low carbon development projects. Second is public-private partnerships. This can be a valuable way to finance renewable energy projects and bring together public and private support partners to share the risks and rewards of renewable energy. For us in the civil society space, we could also do crowdfunding, which is a way to raise money for a large number of people through an online platform. It could be used to finance a variety of renewable energy projects, especially locally led projects. Again, the role of development banks, MDBs. They can provide loans and other financial assistance to renewable energy. And of course, climate funds like the Green Climate Fund. We also have the Adaptation Fund. And there's a number of ways that they could provide financial support to renewable energy projects to developing countries.
Great. Thank you so much. And I know we talked about, the funding can mostly comes in the in loans, right? A lot of loans. So can you guys speak to if these loans come with specific terms or conditions, and how those loans, those conditions, those terms, that interest rate even perpetuate or may perpetuate neocolonialism or dependency? I think that's
Yeah.
really important here, because everyone thinks just loan them some money, but really that is not the answer.
Yeah, so I can kick us off. So firstly, loan agreements they vary. So as I think the question even mentioned, sometimes the loan agreement is there's even a policy change that's associated to the loan agreement, which sometimes the policy change is good, but we have to maintain our sovereignty, right? We have to maintain our national sovereignty when it comes to loans. A lot of people in South Africa are calling some of the loans even um, green structural adjustment programs, which, if you know the history of South African economic system, we have a lot of our systems have been ruined by structural adjustment programs, just as we entered into democracy. So those are some of the examples. And then the interest rates, what's really difficult, especially for those of us in the global south, is that a lot of these loans are in dollars. And so you have to pay it back in dollars, which means that even if the term of the loan doesn't change and nothing else changes, if something happens in your country and your interest rate plummets, that means that your debt increases purely because of the interest rate of your currency versus dollars. And I think that's the biggest issue that we have with loans, is that if we are going to continue to take these loans, there has to be some kind of change in, we cannot be paying this back in dollars. We can't be paying back loans in foreign currencies, because that's really what's keeping Africa and other regions in a debt cycle, really. And Naz is right. We also call it, what we say in South Africa is that, and in Africa at large, is we cannot replace the climate crisis with a debt crisis. So we can't risk having a debt crisis and having economies held back by their debt for the sake of us advancing climate goals, because that is not justice. And it's really not going to affect people on the ground in a good way, because when you have these loan agreements that have you pay back in dollars, it trickles down to the everyday person as being austerity in the country, which means government spending is reduced, which means that any kind of support that vulnerable groups have within the country is reduced. So these loans really do affect people on the ground in a very, very material way.
Terrific. Naz, do you want to add anything to that, or you think that was great? Go ahead.
Courtney's correct. I just want to highlight one facility. Now GCF is funding mitigation and adaptation projects, and now there's a call to set up a loss and damage fund. And there has been debate. Would it be under the World Bank? Would we set up another green climate fund like institution? That would take years, 5 to 7 years, before we could access. Our call, the V20 finance minister's call, representing again 68 developing vulnerable countries, is to set up an IDA-like. What is IDA? It's the International Development Association under the World Bank. IDA is used to finance poverty, providing zero to low interest loans. Let's admit it, we need a lot of money, but grants are very thin right now. So like what Courtney said, there should be concessional loans that would depend country per country, that would also provide debt relief to debt stress vulnerable countries. So what we're pushing for is, again, for easy, accessible access to this climate finance mechanism. Just to give you a number, what we need for loss and damage right now is between 275 billion US dollars to 400 billion US dollars per year by 2030. And right now, what we have is only at 0.0005% minimum amount. Just imagine. So where are we going to get that money?
Yeah, crazy. well, we have to do more, right? Which is kind of why we're here and why we're focusing on this issue at Climate Reality. Before we move on into kind of what folks can do on their own, I want to ask you guys to give one, if you can each give like one example of like a successful climate finance action in developing countries. Like, what is a highlight that you like to highlight of something really positive that's happening and putting pressure and making a difference on finance? I don't know, whichever one of you wants to go.
Naz, you go first.
Okay, I could start. I would just like to highlight a landmark legislation in the Philippines. It's called the People's Survival Fund, or PSF. It's an annual appropriation carved out from our national budget to provide the needed predictable funds in support of local climate change adaptation actions. Maybe some of you would be asking, how about mitigation projects? For us, mitigation projects like renewable energy are also adaptation projects, and we see the reduction of greenhouse gas emission as a co-benefit of adaptation. So I would just like to highlight this. This is specifically tailored for local government units and local organizations. So the People Survival Fund, or the PSF, was crafted to shift the decision-making process of what to ask for and how much to ask to those who are experiencing the effects of climate change firsthand. I think this is a microcosm of us developing countries telling developed countries what we need and how much we need. So it's very clear that developed countries should be listening to developing countries in terms of developing climate finance projects.
Perfect.
Yeah, that's great, Naz. I wish I had an example as as national as that. But I think just in our context with the Just Energy Transition Partnership, which really is such a landmark agreement and really will set precedent for climate finance deals going forward. I think there's been a lot of activism and a lot of advocacy around that across the continent, but really the solidarity, especially between South Africa and Senegal, and really looking at how we advocate and how we campaign for these deals to be public, and for these deals to be transparent and accountable. And that's just something I think has been really positive in the space. I think people are really coming together to talk about climate finance in a more meaningful way, and not just economists, but the everyday person.
Great. And Naz, you want to talk about the tracker?
Yes, I would just like to give a sneak peek of what the Philippines and the African branch will be developing. So we'll soon be developing a climate finance tracker where we will be involving climate reality leaders in our regions, in our country, to basically monitor, account, and put in a database all the climate finance that our countries would be receiving. So in one way or another, we'll be holding developed countries accountable on what they're reporting during United Nations climate change conferences. So this time we'll have the exact number and the exact projects are really being implemented and being tagged as climate finance mitigation or adaptation.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm very excited about this. We're hoping we're going to get a lot of volunteers that can help, a lot of leaders that will help with this. And if it goes really well, we're hoping we can do this in more regions around the world. So stay tuned for more on that. All right. So thank you both so much. A wealth of information and experience here. So really appreciate your time and sharing that with us. Maybe we'll have you back for round 2 sometime soon. So I know we weren't able to answer everyone's questions, and I'm sorry about that. But if you still have a few questions that you wanted to ask, you can email those to support@climatereality.com. And we will share them with our staff and get those answered for you. Also, you can also ask them on Reality Hub, and we'll tell you how to do that in a minute. So right now I'm going to pass the mic to Itzel, who will take us through actions that you can take right now to continue engaging in our climate finance campaign.
Thank you so much, Erin. Yes, I'm so happy to be here with you, and thank you for sticking with us through the webinar. I know we're pressed for time, but I have some crucial calls to action for you. First, knowledge is power. So I encourage each of you to continue educating yourself and also your community. For this, the Africa branch developed a resource called the Fair Financing for Climate Justice Guide, and it serves as an extensive repository where you can delve deeper in the intricacies of climate finance. And more importantly, it empowers you to the actionable insights of how to campaign for fair finance, run impactful workshops, and engage constructively with the media. This guide is an invaluable tool for those of us who seek to transform our financial systems to be more equitable and sustainable. Secondly, in this era of digital connectivity, your voice is more potent than ever. Did you know, and we've just heard about this, that the G20 leaders are currently providing a staggering 1.3 trillion in handouts to the fossil fuel industry? It's high time to say enough, it's enough. We have a digital campaign aimed at urging G20 leaders to stop this regressive financial flow. Your digital signature or share could collectively make a world of difference. And last but not least, let's localize this global issue. The Latin America branch is running a campaign called Invest in the Planet, and we invite you to be part of this mission. Use our communications toolkit to create a short video or post telling us why climate finance is important for your community and how you are investing your time, your resources, and even your love in the planet. And please post it on the social media, in your story, or in your feed and tag us. Your stories are vital because they bring in the human element that facts and figures alone cannot convey. We would love to repost your videos and amplify your voices. So, to recap, educate, take digital action, and make your voice heard. Together, we can catalyze change and make strides toward a more just and sustainable future. And don't worry that we'll be sharing all of these by email after the webinar. Thank you so much. Back to you, Erin.
Thank you so much, Itzel. Yes, so please, we'll be sharing these, and you can also go to the website, Climate Reality website, and check there for more information on climate finance. I want to thank obviously Itzel, Nazarene, and Courtney for your expertise and your time today. It was very valuable. And I want to reiterate again, we're sending out all these resources. We will be following up with an email. You can also, we're also going to do another educational series, the next one being on COP and what is happening at COP28 this December. So stay tuned and watch for that. And then I also want to encourage you all to join the Financing a Just Transition Campaign work group on Reality Hub. So there will be a lot of climate finance information there. You can also chat with one another. I see in the chat that people want to continue to connect on this. So there's a community for you to do that on Reality Hub. And I just want to thank you all so much for joining us. We appreciate your time as well. And we look forward to seeing you at our next session. Thank you.